Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to talk about Venom. Ultimately, the Tom Hardy film. Ultimately, when looking at it, I had seen this movie in the movie theaters, and I think originally I reviewed it via the movie theater. And so, reasonably and or rationally, I kind of just decided, like, hey, how about I just re review it all over again, and in the end, just try to do it this way. And I don't know, it just ultimately just came out to me to just be like, hey, let's just over and redo and review this one. So yeah. So going into this movie, ultimately a lot of people could poke at the special effects of this movie or could either just kind of tear apart this story and just say, oh, it's not that good, or it's too goofy, or it's whatever. When looking at this movie, I thought that it was a fun film. I think that overall, there's still some funny elements to this movie. I like how it's kind of a very dark and gritty kind of film. Reasonably and or rationally, you have Tom Hardy, who, instead of playing this consistent, like, bad character, we have him to where he is almost kind of the comic relief at some portions of this movie. We have it uh, to where Tom Hardy is playing, of course, Eddie Brock in this movie, and I actually like this role of him doing compared to anything else, because really, when I'm honestly looking at it, like Eddie Brock is a reporter. I'm like, oh, okay, so cool. Like, it's weird to kind of see Tom Hardy in this kind of role, knowing full well that he's done a litany of other things, like he's done the movie Locke, or he's done the movie Capone, or he's done the movie Legend, and all kinds of other things that are kind of like he's or Mad Max Fury Road, where ultimately it's either a lot of action or it's a lot of like he always plays these very overly aggressive characters, Bronson and all kinds of like different weird and style characters, ultimately also being of course Bane as well in the Dark Knight Rises. So knowing full well that like Tom Hardy has done all of these action films, like it is kind of interesting for Hardy to, I think, quasi take much more of a back seat in this movie as far as action goes, because a lot of the stuff dips into special effects, and where yeah, he's still doing certain things, but if anything, like his portion in this movie is more tied into being Eddie Brock and being a person that is going to tell the story of Eddie Brock instead of doing the heavy lifting of Eddie Brock, which is eventually going to be Venom, which ultimately is going to be him beating people up, which actually isn't going to be Eddie, it's going to be Venom. So, yeah, so reasonably in this movie, I think Tom Hardy brings more comedy than anything else, and that's what I thought was so fascinating about this role, and that's the reason why I wanted to rewatch this and re look into it. When going into this, looking at this movie to me kind of feels like the anime like Death Note a little bit. To where ultimately we have one guy who is kind of the innocent, and we have the symbiote that is kind of very much the guy that is quickly and easily thinking about how to kill someone, to rip off their head, or try to look at their body and say, this this character has an interesting lung or pancreas or liver or whatever. God, I wish I could just eat that person all up and devour them right now. It also makes for an interesting dialogue comparing it to Eddie Brock, when ultimately the symbiote is like eating people, and he's like, "Oh my god, you just ate a person." It's like, yeah, we had to, um, so that way we can continue on living. Really, I liked the dynamic between the symbiote and Eddie, because reasonably we have it to where even at some point the symbiote is threatening Eddie that if they don't actually get to eat, that ultimately he is going to eat Eddie himself. And so we also find out that it seems that Eddie is also dying while in the symbiote. Because ultimately we find out that this symbiote is really running ragged of his hosts, and we kind of get a little bit of that here and there of the comics. That's why in a lot of times you would have a symbiote trying to go on to uh, being tied to the strongest host that there could possibly be, to the point where they did a lot of what if series of like, what if Venom was Thor, or what if Venom was Hulk, or what if Venom was Peter, or what if Venom was this person, that person, that person, because the symbiote needs the strongest possible person to be the symbiote, so that way this symbiote has a much more longevous life of sorts. So, I when going on to this, it was kind of funny to have Eddie Brock and the symbiote consistently having dialogue with one another, making him seemingly sound crazy to anybody else. But reasonably and rationally looking at it, you had it to where like this symbiote has to like have its own side of things, and Eddie just has to be the passenger going along for this wild ride. And so reasonably that's where like Venom for the longest time would always call itself we, or would always call itself us, and I never quite understood that until finally now within this film, because reasonably I never understood the plural of him talking about himself, because that never quite made sense to me. Even in a lot of the comic books like Agent Venom, it still never quite made sense to me why, like, we'd have Flash Thompson who is taking real control of the symbiote, and to where eventually he has to escalate his power into the real true Venom-esh like power, and but he's trying to tailor off of that to ultimately so that way he can keep in control. Flash could keep in control, because ultimately when uh, Flash escalates his power to the real true Venom like power, like that's when he is just a passenger of this symbiote. So going into this, let's go out of our way to just kind of talk about this movie. For me, like I liked how it seems that Eddie Brock is not a person that is trying to like live the high life. If anything, Eddie Brock is just trying to like, it's not like Eddie Brock has $1 million and ultimately is the like, it seems like Eddie Brock is not like the person that is like the greatest news article person. If anything, like his life is just one F up away from uh, falling apart. And so that's where we get within this movie that Eddie has to do that one more F up to have his life completely fall apart, to where we have this symbiote that is ending up kind of getting him back to a getting him back to not exactly put his life back together, but kind of getting it back to a place of equilibrium where, like, yeah, Eddie Brock had lost everything, but the Venom symbiote is going to help him get it all back towards the end of this film. Because reasonably, Eddie is the only one that or the symbiote is the only one that can give Eddie back his life when he throws it all away. So, anyways, let's go into spoilers about this movie. Let's kind of quickly and easily, hopefully, break it down. There's a lot of technical stuff that ends up happening, but yeah, I just enjoy this movie, and I hope that you enjoy this review. So, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time, it's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So, ultimately, for Spider-Man 3 fans, we kind of have a lot of things from that movie into this film. Because ultimately, in the very beginning of this film, we have a astronaut shuttle that is making its way onto Earth, and ultimately, one of those astronauts is J. Jonah Jameson Jr. That ultimately was in that rocket, making its way back to Earth. While that rocket is going off, we have one of the symbiotes who makes it out of one of its containers, ultimately ending up crashing this ship, or this rocket, to the Earth. So while everyone on the ground is trying to revive or survive or revive any number of these astronauts, we find out that Jameson is the only one that is left alive. Justifiably, Jameson is going to be put into an ambulance to ultimately have us find out that Jameson is the actual symbiote, hence why he's alive. And so Jameson ends up taking his symbiote to be shifted onto the ambulance driver, and also to kill. We have to where Jameson kills the ambulance driver, and also takes his symbiote and shifts it onto the EMT because Jameson is dead. So the EMT ends up making her way onto repetitiously the next person. So we end up having it to where we end up having Eddie Brock's character that now has to be showcased as this big la-di-da-ish like reporter, and so ultimately we have it to where Eddie Brock is waking up for the day to have Annie tell him like, hey, like, make sure you feed the cat and make sure that you make your way to your interview. Ultimately talking about that she's going to be wearing her motorcycle helmet to their wedding day. So ultimately telling us via quite easily the backstory of these two characters, how Eddie Brock is kind of a schlub, and like Annie is kind of this planner and whatever, that ultimately she's already like a kind of much more organized person to Eddie Brock's kind of schlubbish like way of doing things. So we have it seemingly where Eddie is poking his nose into where it doesn't belong, and so ultimately he is getting some information about Carlton Drake through Annie, because ultimately we find out that Annie is a lawyer that is otherwise tied to Carlton Drake's account. And so reasonably we have it to where Eddie is, of course, a person that wants to put his job before anything else. But also with this job, he is escalating to be way too controversial to where even his boss is kind of sketchy on whether or not to keep Eddie as a employee or not. So we ultimately have it to where Eddie ends up going into his interview with Carlton Drake, who is giving a tour to little kids. And so we end up having it to where Eddie does this interview with Drake, kind of doing some easy questions, but then eventually he ends up getting into some information that he should not have been able to have. And Carlton Drake ends up going like, well, hey, I'm not going to answer any of these questions. It's like, hey, like, I hope you'll value the rest of your life after this, because we have it to where shortly after this interview is over, we have it to where uh, Eddie goes to see his boss, and his boss ends up firing him because ultimately Eddie had to have his source come from somewhere for this information, and Eddie doesn't want to give up this source. So his boss is just like, well, I can't trust you. Like, I can't like trust you to do like what I tell you to do, or like I think that you're like poking too far into things. You're poking too hard at the bear. To where like this is going to blow up in our company's face. So goodbye, Eddie. You're fired. So we ultimately have Eddie, who is making his way to Annie, where we find out that Annie is also fired. And so recently, Annie ends up giving Eddie his ring back, and ultimately telling her, or Annie tells Brock that he had used her, and ultimately she is done with him, and that reasonably he has consistently been like his own problem, that ultimately he could try to push off that it's not his fault, but it's always his fault, that he's always going to be the person that is going to ruin his life, and he doesn't want to be any part of that, and so on and so forth, and those kinds of ways in which to mention this. So Eddie is now having to go back to his apartment. Where ultimately his neighbor evidently is a guitarist who ultimately plays his music way too loud. So we eventually have it to where Brock is making his way into this this seemingly little grocery store, ultimately with this woman named Chen. And so reasonably, Chen ultimately tells Brock, it's like, God, you look like garbage. You look like crap. And so Eddie's like, oh, well, thanks. It's like, if anything, like, yeah, if anything, we have it to where Brock had been given by Chen some meditation tapes, but ultimately Brock had said that they were in Mandarin or whatever, and he couldn't understand them. But ultimately, he just kind of lied about using the meditation tapes. So we have it to where Brock is getting some groceries from this store, and the place ends up getting held up by this guy that is consistently asking for money, protection money, I guess, and so Eddie can't do anything about it. So we ultimately at Carlton Drake's headquarters, we end up finding that they have all these symbiotes from they have the other symbiotes from the rocket, and now they are going to just test it on a lot of people. Reasonably, they find out that supposedly they need a very specific person to be hosted into this specific symbiote. It seems that there is some DNA connection, or there's some very significant connection to get to the right symbiote. And so recently they have it to where they're just testing it on a bunch of people, and it seems that they eventually find out uh, that when people are being placed within these symbiotes, it seems like they're also dying. Because reasonably we have Carlton Drake that is ultimately seeing that, oh my god, like this body is not strong enough. Like a human body is not strong enough to hold this symbiote. It's like, God, what a waste of a species that we cannot be strong enough to host this symbiote. Because ultimately, like he's saying how like humans are such a weaker species and everything like that, really placing the fact that he is going to be the villain of this movie. So we have it to where Eddie Brock is at the grocery store and kind of talking about how reasonably and or rationally, like, he's able to like hide in plain sight and be able to disappear and whatever. But ultimately, there is this doctor that is in this grocery store that is horrible at it, which is Dr. Skirth. Skirth is ultimately going to Eddie and desperately mentioning that, hey, like, uh, we have Carlton Drake, who is testing these symbiotes on humans, reasonably rationally trying to figure out the perfect symbiote to where ultimately he is manipulating people and telling them whatever they need to in order to make them uh, be a host for this symbiote. But like Carlton Drake doesn't exactly know what he's dealing with. He's playing God, and so ultimately Eddie wants really nothing to do with this. Uh, but it seems that more and more, because ultimately he is no longer tied to the story, more and more he's just like, well, I have nothing better to do. I'm just going to drink away my woes and otherwise think about the life and how great that I had it before. And so recently, since Eddie has nothing better to do, he's going to go with Skirth to get this story to see if he can buy back his job with it. So we have it to where Eddie makes his way get to this lab. Ultimately, Skirth is going to skirt away some of the security guards that are through here and this and that. So we eventually have Eddie making his way into this laboratory where, fortunately or unfortunately, we had a homeless woman named Maria that was trying to sucker um, Eddie into buying a newspaper for $5, but Eddie ends up giving her $20 um, because she doesn't want to hear her sing. And so recently we have Maria that shows up in this laboratory with one of the symbiotes, and he is trying to. We have it to where Eddie is trying to help Maria escape from this laboratory because he's like, oh my god, like, she's a person I know and this and that, so I'm going to help her. So we have it to where Eddie tries to help Maria, but Maria ends up helping herself onto Eddie Brock to give Eddie the symbiote. So Eddie ends up escaping from this laboratory because all kinds of alarms and everything like that are going off. And so recently we have Eddie escaping to eventually, slowly but surely, realize that seemingly without his real and true knowledge, he has the symbiote within himself because reasonably, while escaping, he is taking down some security guards in an unusual manner. It seems that he is running through a forest and at a very weird or strange like rate. He's crashing through some security gate and climbing up a tree really, really fast. So we end up having to where it seems that Eddie is consistently hungry to the point of him seemingly trying to grab anything possible, tater tots, uh, a piece of chicken that is in the trash, and so on and so forth. But then eventually we have Eddie Brock Ralph this all up. And we are consistently finding that Eddie is very, very hungry. And it seems like the Symbiote is every once in a while just saying a word or two or this and that, but recently Eddie is trying to figure out where that is actually from, where the sound is coming from. At some points, Eddie is walking around town or just um, trying to get on a bus or anything along those lines of transport to where we have it to where Eddie is having his body forcing himself to move somewhere or attack someone or ultimately want to do something, and we have it to where Eddie is trying to control his own body to where it doesn't move anywhere or anything along those lines. So we eventually have Eddie, who is hearing a voice that is ultimately talking and mentioning that it's hungry. To where the point of it is where Annie ends up, or to where uh, to where Eddie ends up trying to make his way back to Annie, and Eddie finds out that Annie is now dating a doctor, and ultimately we find out that their relationship is going so well that the doctor, Dr. Dan Lewis, is ultimately living with Annie because the relationship is going so well. So we end up having it to where Annie is at this seemingly lobster like place, and Eddie finds his way to her uh, to ultimately talk to her. And to ultimately mention that he feels really, really sick, ultimately to dip himself into the lobster tank um, because he is really, really hot. And we have it to where consistently Eddie is grabbing the food of anyone that is in the restaurant and eating their food off of their plate. And so we have it to where Eddie is going to probably get the cops called on to him. Um, and so they end up leaving this establishment. And so we have it to where Annie uh, calls Brock and saying like, "Yeah, we think that you have a parasite within you." And Eddie's like, "Oh, a parasite? Oh, that's great." And so we have it to where Dan Lewis is also on the same call with Annie to be like, "Yeah, we think you have a parasite. If anything, we're gonna like, if anything, I can kind of prescribe you some medications so we can kind of get rid of all this." And of course, the symbiote is like, "Well, never gonna happen." Like, so we have it to where this symbiote is like talking to Eddie, and again, Eddie doesn't know where this sound is coming from, to the point to where Eddie is telling Annie that like, should I be able to hear voices? Should I be able to climb up a really tall tree really quickly? And and the doctor is also mentioned is like, well, you could be hallucinating, or you could be just like your body could be kind of uh like working at a different rate than normal people because of this parasite. It could be a possibility. So eventually we get to where that eventually Eddie is going to be found out by Carlton Drake's people. So eventually they are going to make their way to get to Eddie, because we have it to where Eddie is ultimately hearing the sounds of his neighbor, and ultimately after Eddie vomits out of the toilet and looks himself in the mirror, he gets to see like some of the Venom face popping out, which scares him and knocks him into the back of his tub. And then ultimately, when his neighbor is playing his guitar, like we have Eddie who is mentioning, it's like, "Hey man, I'm really sick. Could you not play any like? Could could you not play your music tonight? And the neighbor is like, yeah, sure, whatever. But then ultimately, um, Eddie showcases Venom a little bit within his face, and then the guitarist is like, okay, dude, I'm not gonna do anything. So we have Eddie just again trying in desperation to eat any number of food that doesn't quite make sense, and so really we have it to our Treese and the rest of these Carlton Drake people are making their way into Eddie Brock's apartment. To ultimately, the symbiote is telling him, "Don't answer that door," and to where Eddie answers it anyways, and to where the guys end up grabbing him. To where all of a sudden now we have to showcase the Venom power. So we have it to where Venom is kind of strong arming people, kind of flinging people. We have Eddie Brock who is taking a stool and breaking the stool off of people. It seems that Venom is trying to avoid Eddie getting shot, so he kind of maneuvers out of the way of bullets, and all kinds of interesting things going on. To where eventually there is also a point to where Eddie is running off to be chased by these people, and eventually he does all these weird and amazing things to get around within the symbiote. To where ultimately uh, Eddie's doing, or the motorcycle and Eddie are doing things that you wouldn't normally want a person to try to do, but ultimately the symbiote is, with its power, going to help Eddie get to stay alive. So we have it to where within all these interesting and cool things going on, and all these special effects going on as well that could be cheesy and whatever, but I enjoy it. We have it to where Eddie eventually gets into a car accident because ultimately one of the vehicles smashes into his motorcycle, which ultimately seems to break every single bone in his body. And so we're to naturally assume that Eddie is going to die at this point, or the symbiote is going to have to go to someone else. But what ends up happening instead is that the symbiote ends up re-healing up Eddie's legs and everything else that is broken, and ends up grabbing Treese by the neck, and there is some other guard of sorts that ends up getting behind Venom, and so we have it to where Venom ends up eating the head of this other guy and leaving Treese completely alive, and but probably knocked out of sorts or kind of shoved out of the way. And then so Venom goes on the run. So we have it to where Venom ends up swimming away to go underneath this bridge. So ultimately, the symbiote is ultimately telling Eddie that they need to coexist. And so reasonably it seems that symbiote is kind of like taking charge and ultimately telling Eddie what to do and this and that, and that ultimately they need to kill people in order to have the symbiote to consistently stay alive, to that they need organs, they need heads, they need whatever, because ultimately when the symbiote tries to kill everybody before in Eddie's room, the symbiote mentions like, hey, how about we eat all of their heads and stack all their bodies somewhere. And Eddie's like, why would we do that? It's like, because it makes sense. So we reasonably rationally have it to where Eddie is like kind of taking command, or kind of a backseat driver of this parasite, or this symbiote. And so recently we have to where this symbiote is in control at the very beginning of this movie, but it seems there's eventually going to be a transition to that. Because reasonably, the symbiote is mentioning how Eddie is a loser. And so the symbiote is like, yeah, like, if anything, the reason why I chose you is you are a lot like me. You're a loser. So, reasonably, like, what a perfect web we've meted, or we've tied these two people that are seemingly insignificant to their species or their race of sorts. And so, really speaking of that, we consistently have another symbiote that is through person to person to person to person, making their way ultimately to repetitiously uh, get to somewhere. Ultimately to, I guess, Carlton Drake. Really, we have the MT person that ends up kind of uh, finding some fish of sorts, like repetitiously starts eating it, and everybody's like, "Hey, what the heck? Like, you're eating my food. You're not paying for it." And so we have the MT who is killing the guy that ultimately was selling this food. And so it seems like there seems to be some thugs of sorts that end up trying to get close to the CMT, and the EMT ends up getting these projectile weapons that come from out of her body to kill anybody that comes near or close to her. To ultimately, there is some old lady that is to be there, and so ultimately we have the EMT person take the kill off the EMT person to now be this old lady, and so we have this going on for a very long time. This symbiote is going from person to person, person to person, to make her way to Carlton Drake. Because ultimately, Carlton Drake is eventually going to be Riot. So, while that is all going on, the fun of all that, we ultimately have it to where Eddie is eventually getting to the point of just going like, you know what, like, whatever this thing is, like, I need it out of me. So ultimately, we have it to where Eddie is eventually going into the hospital, and because we have it to where Eddie sees Annie and is ultimately they are going to the hospital because we have it to where eventually Eddie is going to make his way to his boss's office to deliver is going to make his way to deliver this evidence of what they're doing in this lab. And so we have it to where Eddie is crashing his way through this building because reasonably he is going to climb his way all up to this building, which is ultimately going to lead to having the guys that are for Carlton Drake to try to said kill said Venom. But anyways, we have to where that Eddie brings the evidence to his boss. His boss isn't there, so ultimately he leaves a note that says, "Do the right thing, shithead," and then eventually goes into the elevator instead of jumping off of the building. And of course, Venom calls him a pussy. And so we have it to where Eddie goes into the elevator and makes his way down to the very first floor, and he is to be presented within all of these assault SWAT-ish like guys that are probably justifiably with Carlton Drake's people. So we have it to where, of course, now Venom has to make his way through all these people, ending at some point, of course, ripping off the head of one of these people, and trying to kill everyone else. So we have it to where seemingly Annie ends up seeing Venom turn back into Eddie, and she's like, "Oh my god!" And so Eddie's like, "Yeah, I have a parasite in me," as if he has to say that through most of the movie. And so Annie is just like, "Hospital now!" So we have it to where they make their way to the hospital, and we have it to where the symbiote is kind of taking a liking to Annie, because when they get into the car, Eddie's like, "You know what? I don't think I'm safe. Like, I don't think you're safe with me being in this car with you." And the symbiote is like, "Hey, like, go with her. Like, I like her." So, so we have it to where Eddie goes into the car, and ultimately it seems that the symbiote likes Annie as well. So at some points he's like, the symbiote is telling Eddie that it's like, "Hey, you should apologize to her for ruining her life, because this might be the last time you talk to her." So we have it to where Eddie apologizes to Annie for basically getting her fired and ruining her life, and ultimately Eddie mentions that he loves her, and Annie's like, "Well, hey, like, there's a lot going on right now. It's like, if anything, like, let's not get that far into talking or whatever." And so pushing us on to have Eddie go to the hospital and supposedly get an MRI, which Venom is saying we can't get an MRI because evidently the sounds could ultimately kill the symbiote. So pushing on to Eddie going into the hospital, and they end up doing a battery of tests, and Dan Lewis, or Dr. Dan Lewis, ultimately is telling Eddie that he's dying, because it seems that the symbiote is ultimately seemingly taking and running through uh, some of Eddie's organs. So basically, he is almost close to death, and so reasonably we have it to where Eddie is like, "Dude, the symbiote is killing me." And so the symbiote is like, "No, I can help you. Like, I can heal you. Like, I can help. I can save you." And so the symbiote, and so Eddie is just kind of really upset to the point to where ultimately we have it to where Eddie is just trying to get whatever this is out of him. So ultimately, they turn on the MRI machine, and ultimately, Eddie and the symbiote separate. And we have it to where now the symbiote is in its supposedly own locked and sealed room, but not quite sealed enough. So we have it to where Eddie is angry at the symbiote. It's like, "Oh, hey, look at you. You're dying now, just like I am. Like, ha ha ha, sucks to be you." And so ultimately, Eddie is frustrated, and so he is leaving. And Dr. Lewis is like, "What the heck is this?" Like, "I've never seen this before in my life." So we have to where seemingly like Annie and Dr. Lewis are just talking about things and talking about like what's going all on, and then ultimately Annie is realizing that the symbiote is, I guess, gone. The symbiote had gone through an air duct or like a ventilation shaft of sorts to ultimately make its way onto seemingly a dog. So we have it to where Brock is making his way out of this hospital to be taken by, of course, the Treesmen and taken by Carlton Drake, so that way they can justifiably get him to get to the symbiote. But the only thing is, the symbiote is now not with Eddie Brock. So we have it to where the dog, ultimately seeing Annie, ultimately the symbiote is now going to latch itself onto Annie to get to Brock. So Brock is now on his way to having to hear Carlton Drake talk about things, just going on and on about like, hey, where's the symbiote? Like ultimately, I want to see it. I want it. Like ultimately, like yeah, I wanted this Venom thing. Like why? Like what did you do with it? Blah 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 blah. We ultimately also have Treese that is threatening Eddie Brock and everything like that. And Eddie Brock headbutts Treese in the head, and this and that. Eddie Brock is mentioning that he's like, dude, I don't care about anything because I'm dying already. So like, what are you gonna do? Like, what worse thing are you gonna do to me? Like, I don't have the symbiote and this and that. We have Carlton Drake that is going to showcase now that he is actually Riot, because Carlton Drake ultimately had gone all his way to be at the lab, and there was some girl that showed up that ended up grabbing onto Carlton Drake because this girl was the Riot symbiote to get to Carlton Drake. So now we find out that Carlton Drake is Riot, and so when Riot shows himself, Eddie Brock's like, God, that is the ugliest thing that I've ever seen. So, pushing on, we have to ultimately that Annie is going to eventually help Eddie Brock escape while being Venom. And so, reasonably, we have it to where Annie and Eddie kiss, to where the symbiote is going to transfer from Annie onto Eddie. And so, reasonably, we have it to where Annie wants to be a part of this fight, but Brock is saying no. Like, if anything, like, things are too dangerous, blah, 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 blah. So we have Riot, who ultimately is ultimately wanting to get a rocket to go to outer space to find the other symbiotes to bring them down here to ultimately create annihilation to this world, to have everybody go to every, so that way everybody can be a symbioted like person and have the host take over, and that's the ultimate plan. Because ultimately we find out in a Guardians of the Galaxy comic book that there is like a planet of symbiotes, and so reasonably, if there were like very few kinds of symbiotes here and there, like there are definitely going to be more and more that eventually siphon and or come out eventually, and so we're going to find that out. So reasonably, we have it to where Eddie has to stop Carlton Drake and or Riot from being from being onto the rocket and trying to get to his planet and this and that. It seems like Venom is completely fine with otherwise being on this planet now, because ultimately, when he goes to his planet, he's actually a loser there, but if he can stay on this planet, he thinks that he can be much more resourceful, and that ultimately he could be like one of a kind in a planet of which of no one has seen anything like him. And so Venom is kind of very completely copacetic and or fine with being on this planet now. He doesn't want to go off on a rocket with Riot to go back to his own home planet, and so on and so forth. So we have it to where we have this fight out. Ultimately, Venom is telling Eddie that there is 0% chance for them to win this fight, because ultimately Riot's character has weaponry that Eddie has never seen before. And so while they are fighting, of course, Eddie's like, holy and he's like, told you. Like, told you, like a lot of the stuff that Riot isn't inventing or Riot is doing isn't anywhere close to what Venom can do or what Venom could come up with. So we have it to the point of Riot even separating the symbiote from Eddie, and Eddie needing to uh, jump to get the symbiote to reattach to him to fight off Riot still. To the point to where repetitiously we just have it to where Riot is just overpowering Venom, and to the point to where uh, Eddie is just going to be Eddie, because ultimately the symbiote needs some time to reboot, because ultimately there is either sound weapons or there's sounds going off that ultimately can conflict with what is all going on right now. Because ultimately we have Annie, who is going to use like a sound thing to ultimately get it to where it kind of wipes out Riot and Venom. So pushing on, we have it to where that Riot ends up putting a seemingly Venom to ultimately assess that Venom is going to die, or Eddie is going to die. And so reasonably Riot makes his way up onto the ship, and so Venom ends up getting back into Eddie and ends up taking his spike from out of his chest into uh, coming up into the rocket. And so Venom ends up slicing the rocket to where the rocket ends up exploding in midair to kill Riot. And so reasonably that resolves everything, because Venom is basically saying like, haha, like I'm going to be able to get you, and ultimately this is what Venom does. So pushing us on to the hurrah hurrah moment, where reasonably we find out after the fact that Drake is dead, and so reasonably we have it to where Eddie Brock is now getting his news reporter job back, and reasonably the first story that they want him to do is the Drake story, but he doesn't want to do anything. He kind of wants to push and to do something else. To ultimately Annie is with him when she's asking him about where his job is going, where his life is going, and ba 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 ba. Because ultimately it seems that Annie wants to get back with Brock, and because ultimately him having this symbiote is going to make him a much more interesting person. So we have it to where Eddie is ultimately seemingly going to he's ultimately going to be a person that is going to do some news article, maybe him revealing that he is Venom, but ultimately he doesn't want to have Annie figure out what that news article is until she reads whatever news article that he wrote. So we eventually have Brock making his way through town, ultimately to make his way back into this grocery store. because we have it to where seemingly Venom is hungry, and so ultimately he's asking Eddie to get him something to eat, or he's going to eat Eddie's liver. So it seems that we have Eddie go to the grocery store for tater tots and chocolate, and so we have it to where we have the same guy come in to hold up this grocery store again, uh, and we have it to where Venom is ultimately there. We have it to where Eddie, before we get to the grocery store, is telling Venom, it's like, well, hey, like, you can't just go around just eating any random person. Like, if anything, like, we're only gonna let you eat, I'm only gonna let you eat really bad people. And now we have to figure out which ones are really good and which ones are really bad. And so, uh, kind of Eddie towards the end of this movie is taking much more control of this symbiote and really tailoring to like when they are going to actually kill people. So at the very end of this grocery store like thing, we have it to where Eddie is now looking at this guy that is holding up this grocery store, and Venom is asking like, "Bad guy, right?" And Eddie's like, "Yep." So we have it to where Venom is now grabbing onto this grocery store thug, and we have Venom who is saying like, "Don't ever come to this grocery store again, or I'm gonna make you a legless, armless, headless turd that is just shuffling off into the wind, and like I'm gonna threaten you to never come back here again because we are Venom." But then eventually Venom anyways just eats the guy's head and kills him, and ultimately Chan is like, "Oh my god!" Like, what is wrong with you? And that's when Eddie's mentions like, "Oh, I guess it seems like I have a parasite." So Venom is ultimately just like, "God, why do you keep calling me a parasite?" It's like, well, like it's a term of endearment and this and that. And so while they walk off, the credits roll and the movie ends. Really, this is a fun movie. I enjoy it. I don't care about the special effects. I just really enjoy the story. Um, I really like Tom Hardy in this movie as well as any other film. So recently, when Tom Hardy was put into this, I'm like, yeah, this is the best reason for um, me to go see this movie, is just to see it because Tom Hardy's in it, and plus I enjoy a lot of these Marvel films, especially Venom. I hope the second movie is even better than the first, and plus I'm maybe hoping that Venom is going to be at some point tied to otherwise any number of these Spider-Man things going forward. I'm hoping that I'm hoping that they're not going to just toss him into everything, because that would be a little bit goofy if Venom is in Spider-Man 3, because I'm like, okay, like how are they going to tie that whole thing in, and as well as him being with not only like Venom but maybe a number of cluster of other people that ultimately are going to be in this Spider-Man 3 movie. There's going to be a ton of crap going on in this Spider-Man 3 movie, as well as maybe even the Doctor Strange 2 film, because they desperately need to sell these Marvel films going forward, and they're trying to get as big as actors as they can possibly get to be in any number of these things. So when looking at it, there's a bunch of crap all going on. So at the end of the day, that's all I wanted to say about this movie. I Yeah, this movie is is good because I really realized like how it was going to be compared to other things. Like Captain Marvel, I was kind of like disappointed in that film because like, well, maybe it could be a really good movie, and I was just like, not really, because ultimately Brie Larson just kind of kills everything. And like for Ant Man and the Wasp, I'm like, well, the first Ant Man I thought was kind of a fun movie, but it was kind of rough. And then going into Ant-Man and the Wasp, I'm like, man, this movie is really rough. Really rough. It's too goofy. It's too silly. It's too. It goes too far into silliness. And so for this movie, like, I thought that this movie, I'm like, yeah, this is a good approach. I think the story is pretty solid, and I think the story is probably better than anything else that goes on in this movie. That I could reasonably buy the story, regardless of how every single visual appeals upon this movie and the effects of it all, and how it doesn't seem very seamless or whatever. Like, still, like, I could reasonably buy the story of this film, and I think that's all that I need to go out of my way to say. But anyways, I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.